Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. Let me go through a couple of housekeeping items before I start the presentation. I think today's session is going to cover a lot of ground, and if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A box on the desktop and submit your question, and I will get to the questions throughout the presentation. If you do have any follow-up questions, I'm more than happy to reply to you. My email address is saronsoff@flexpay.io, but there is going to be a follow-up email, and my email address will be contained in there, so don't worry about writing it down right now. But let me welcome you to, we're going to have a very special session today that focuses on a topic that is becoming increasingly important, which is how to evaluate failed payment recovery solutions. We'll go through a lot of context and why this is important. My name is Steve Aronsoff. I am the Senior Vice President of Marketing at FlexPay. And as I said, we're going to cover a topic today that is becoming increasingly relevant and important for both for-profit companies and nonprofits alike. And what we're seeing is that awareness of the problem of failed payments is becoming higher, and awareness of the pain that they cause in one of the root causes of avoidable churn is also still becoming more aware. Now, today what we're going to do is we're going to go through this topic in detail, and I think it's so important to not really understand failed payments and the root causes and have a total picture of what impact it has on your organization, because this perspective is so important to understand the different types of failed payments, what customer reactions are to them, and you find that it absolutely shapes your understanding not only the failed payment problem, but also what good looks like or what best looks like in order to solve the problem, particularly in the context of what you can do to choose technology and solutions to solve the problem, but also integrate these into your processes and into your subscriber or sustainer experiences to make sure that you're minimizing the problem, but also maintaining high levels of satisfaction. Now, this information is incredibly important for companies and organizations, whether you are looking to deploy your first recovery solution, whether you're thinking about upgrading from an internally home-developed solution, or even if you're trying to upgrade or thinking about upgrading from a third-party provider. This context and this knowledge is also really vital to understand. And it really, again, I think will help shape your perspective on what great looks like. So let's get started. So at the core of every subscription business, whether it's your customers you're working with or subscribers, the retention component of everything that we do is so vital, right? We also know that this has become harder in the last year and a half for a variety of reasons. Voluntary churn rates, or your customers and subscribers, your subscribers and your sustainers choosing to end their relationship with you has increased as inflation has forced cutbacks in expenses. We also know that new subscriber and sustainer growth has slowed. It's often become more expensive as competition for media and acquisition has become more difficult. And retention is always going to be one of the most important metrics or KPIs for our businesses, because it's one of the really few avenues to be able to grow revenue and profits. It's certainly the easiest and most efficient way to grow revenue and profits or resources you have available to manage for your cause. So when we talk about retention, we talk about involuntary churn and failed payments. Breaking apart, when you look at what are your root causes of churn is really important to understand. Voluntary churn, the definition of voluntary churn, of course, is when your subscribers or sustainers choose to end their relationship with you voluntarily. They make that active, conscious decision. And then involuntary churn is churn caused by payment problems, usually failed payments. And what's, I think, interesting and new for a lot of companies or organizations is that, in fact, involuntary churn is actually the single biggest cause of churn in most cases. Usually it represents about 50% of all churn. And the challenge that brings, of course, is that for the companies and organizations that do work really hard to reduce their churn levels, they typically only think about churn in the context of voluntary churn, and not in the context of what we can do to really understand for the involuntary what we want to do to be able to solve it. And so that allows us to break apart what the root causes are and apply the best practices, processes, and technology to be able to solve this. Okay, we have a first question in from Michelle, and Michelle's question is this replacing an existing service? And I think the context of the question is, when we think about involuntary churn solutions, should we only be thinking about replacing an existing service? And I think in most cases, the companies that have recognized this and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, that recognition is growing, often take a first step by building home-built solutions. Usually the format of that is building algorithms in their technology team to just retry failed payments and card payments over and over again as some rules-based approach, or perhaps sending the failed payments to customers or sustainers over to the customer service team for outreach. That's a good place to start. Some organizations are just getting started with it, and some have actually taken a step of working with a third-party solution. But again, I think all this, as I said before, all this content and context is really important to understand, because even if you already have a solution in place, most likely this is going to reset your understanding of what good looks like and all the factors to consider. And if you're just getting started, it allows you to jumpstart that initial phase and choose a solution that's going to best meet your needs, in both from a short-term and a long-term perspective of delivering short-term benefits as well as maintaining customer satisfaction and retention for a long period of time. Hopefully, Michelle, that answers your question. So let's talk about failed payments a little bit and really understand the context of it. And the important thing to understand is that the failed payment has nothing to do with your company or your organization. It is a friction and a problem that's inherent in the payment system. What we know from MasterCard and Visa's own data is that somewhere between 10% and 25% of all credit card authorizations will fail. It's particularly acute when what they call card not present or merchant-initiated transactions, where your subscriber or your sustainer has given you a credit card and you're initiating that. Of course, MasterCard and Visa and the banks that issue the cards have that knowledge about that, and they treat those transactions as riskier transactions. So we see this very high decline rate because the issuing banks think that there's a risk of fraud, and so they're being overly active in declining these transactions. So the pain of this means that we see that, and the numbers vary a little bit, but in North America alone for subscription businesses, we estimate about $280 billion in lost revenue in 2022. This is higher now, of course. This translates to over $450 billion in lost revenue globally. So enormous amounts of friction that are created and enormous amounts of pain as a result of this problem. Now, when we talk about involuntary churn, of course, it's probably self-evident, but I think it bears repeating what the pain that it causes. And I think this also will reset the expectation of when many organizations or companies think about a failed payment, they view it as a transactional problem, right? We submitted a transaction for payment. It either clears or doesn't clear. If it fails, then we try to just resubmit it or find a way to get that transaction to clear. That really, I think, is a overly narrow view of the problem, because the reality is that when a payment fails for a subscription or a sustainer relationship, if the failed payment is not recovered, the entire relationship with that customer or sustainer is going to be lost in the future. So not just the one transaction, but all the subsequent payments that person would have made. So when we think about reducing involuntary churn, there's a swath of metrics and KPIs we look at in order to really assess the true damage that it causes. So when we can reduce involuntary churn, conversely, what it means is that additional revenue is created, and that additional revenue is not just, again, in a single payment, but all the additional payments that that subscriber or sustainer will provide in the future. Of course, that revenue tends to be very, very profitable. So there's additional profits generated or resources available to be able to issue to causes. It helps improve retention, and it also improves customer LTV. All those metrics are, I think, in most cases, the core metrics that subscription businesses and nonprofits are trying to optimize revenue, incoming revenue, and resources to be able to drive the business or the organization. So you can see that reducing involuntary churn, of course, is incredibly tied to strategic value and strategic resources that organizations have to work with. So the good news is that awareness of failed payments is starting to become more common. In fact, we're seeing more and more of the experts talking about failed payments and trying to raise awareness of the problem with companies and organizations. Here's a couple of quotes. Robbie Kellerman-Baxter is a frequent speaker and an expert consultant in the subscription space. And her statement is, why are there still so many otherwise sophisticated companies that don't focus on involuntary churn, which it's a great question to ask. And we're even seeing the technology analytics firms and like Forrester start to focus on the problem, recognizing that payment failures are a common occurrence, and that the second half of that is the recognition that the payments experience itself, what customers and sustainers experience when there is a failed payment, is absolutely tied to customer satisfaction and your business growth. So we actually talk a lot about the fact that optimizing the payments experience, trying to make sure it's seamless and painless as possible. But when there is an issue, making sure that we're factoring in customer satisfaction as part of the KPI that we measure as an outcome is so important. And we'll go into that in a minute about what that looks like. So one of the, I think, the most important questions to ask and to have an answer to is when a failed payment occurs, not only is it what damages occur if the problem is not resolved, but we also want to factor in what is your customer or your sustainer's reaction when they become aware of a failed payment. We know from a variety of sources that the immediate reaction is overwhelmingly negative. I think it's obvious to think about that. When we experience a failed payment, which probably everybody has, it's emotional. We think that, I know I have, if it's an ATM card, that I have funds in my account. If it's a credit card, I know I have credit to be able to buy. Why is my card failing with you when it's working everywhere else? And the reality is that when a consumer or sustainer experiences a failed payment, they don't understand that the bank is the institution that declined the payment. They blame you because, again, the card tends to work everywhere else. In fact, from a research study that we ran with the payments organization recently, over 30% of customers identified that as soon as they're aware of the failed payment, their perception, their customer satisfaction with the brand immediately went down. And of course, when the customer is aware of the failed payment, it creates the opportunity for them to decide whether or not they want to continue with the subscription or the relationship or not. So this insight is really important to realize, because what it does bring up as an imperative is that whenever possible, if there's an opportunity to resolve a failed payment and avoid customer awareness of it, that is the best case outcome, because we avoid all the negative experiences that become associated with the brand and potentially additional voluntary churn down the road. Even if the subscriber or sustainer chooses to solve the problem in the short term, we do see increased rates of voluntary churn after the fact. So we want to avoid awareness whenever possible. Now, one of the other factors that you should consider when you're thinking about what are we trying to optimize for in our failed payment recovery process is the obvious answer is we want to maximize the recovery of the failed payments. But when we talk about other insights, like we want to minimize a negative customer experience, it becomes really, I think, self-evident that we want to do a couple things. We want to judge the performance of our failed payment recovery solution in 3 dimensions. One is we want to maximize recovery. Of course, it's important to make sure that we are solving as many failed payments as possible. We also want to make sure that we understand, though, that we want to measure and understand and maximize the retention of those subscribers and sustainers after the failed payment experience occurs. And that really gets into what is the experience that we're delivering during the payments process during recovery. And that's the most effective way to measure whether or not customer service satisfaction is being harmed, is do we see that retention from various options we have for recovery are working the way we want to, just keeping the relationship alive. And directly tied to that, of course, is maximizing the LTV of that subscriber or sustainer after the fact as well. But how much additional payments that person the organization is making, and because that ties directly to additional revenue and profitability. On top of that, of course, we want to make sure that we're avoiding harm that could potentially be created by the merchant account. There are some practices that will serve to increase the merchant account risk score you have. Being overly aggressive on retries, or avoid, any solution that causes an increase in chargebacks or refunds. Obviously, that drives additional costs for you, because the MasterCard and Visa system imposes very strict and severe penalties for chargebacks and refunds. You want to minimize those. Actually, in fact, what you should see is that your recovery solution doesn't increase your chargebacks or refunds at all. And then lastly, there are some practices that are very aggressive, that are are at best frowned upon by MasterCard and Visa and the banks, or even banned by them, that you want to avoid, that are employed by some of the solutions out in the marketplace. And it's important to recognize those because while they may drive a short-term bump in recovery rates, they do cause lasting damage to your merchant account and your relationship with the banking system. I'm not going into details, but if you have any questions about that, I can follow up with you directly and give you a little more context about what those look like. Okay, we have another question from Emily. Emily asks, what are the KPIs for success? What is considered success? Great question. I think there's a little bit of an answer that it depends on which company or organization. And what I mean by that is the recovery rates you're able to earn from failed payment recovery solutions depends on a number of factors. Of course, the complexity and scope of your solution will have a direct impact. And we'll go into a little bit about ways to think about that. Certainly, how you acquire your customers or sustainers. If you're using more aggressive teaser offers, for example, or trial offers, that often has that correlates with lower rates of recovery down the road. If your demographic is less wealthy, that tends to have higher risk consumers. It tends to have a negative effect on recovery rates. From a recovery perspective, we see that typically the rate of recovery when the best-in-class recovery solution is being applied against a failed payment immediately upon failure, on the low end is usually around 20–25%. We've seen as high as 85–90%. So it really does vary based on your business and your customer demographics or sustainer demographics. But the other factors, again, what I think is really important to understand is that measuring the recovery rate is incredibly important for obvious reasons. It generates more revenue, more profitability or resource to work with in the short term. But these other factors, the other KPIs to look at, which is measuring the retention of those customers after recovery and measuring the value that they deliver to you and the sum total of all the payments they make after recovery, and tracking that, to me, is also just as important as a KPI for success, because what you'll likely see is that different methods of recovery will give you different outcomes on the retention and the LTV perspective, and really working to optimize those has a larger impact on your overall company health than even in the short-term recovery results. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, when we talk about the problem of failed payments, it's also important to realize that there are many reasons why card transactions are declined. And in fact, there are literally hundreds of decline codes that banks will reply back with when a payment has failed. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. It's a deeper conversation. I'm happy to follow up anybody if they're curious about diving into this particular topic. The key takeaway from looking at the different types of declines, though, is, of course, there's truly bad card and fraud. Fraudulent transactions, we have no interest in trying to solve those. Bad actors on the consumer side, obviously, or a card that has been stolen, we obviously want to make sure that doesn't get into the system. But sometimes bad cards that have been expired or invalid card number will require engagement and interaction and support by the subscriber or sustainer to solve. Other types of transactions that are what are called soft declines. They're more generic reason codes like do not honor, a generic bank decline, reason codes like that often can be solved working directly with the banking system. And when we look at it this way, that really gives the landscape of a strategy about how we work to solve the failed payments on each individual transaction level, each individual customer level, and apply different solutions that will work to optimize, again, those three KPIs: recovery rates, working directly with the payment system as much as possible to avoid any interaction and exposure for your customers to the failed payments, and then lastly, working to optimize retention and LTV. So what this means is that we really are talking about an approach that uses different disciplines, different technologies, different solutions to be able to solve the problem. So this is a layout showing that when we can, particularly, I mean, it's overly simplistic, but generally with a soft decline, we can work directly with the payment system and avoid the failed payment. We do want to make sure that the technology that's being used is sophisticated enough to craft a strategy that it can communicate with each individual issuing bank, because the reality is that different issuing banks, the banks that issue cards to card holders have different rules, different levels of risk assessment on how they evaluate each transaction request. So having a technology that can evaluate down to the level of why was this transaction declined, which bank declined it, and numerous other factors is really important to make sure that's been applied, because that will affect the ability to generate the best short-term recovery rates. And then on the other hand, when we do have to interact with the customer or a sustainer, having technology, having process, having communications paths that allow us to engage with the customer or sustainer, working to gain their participation, their active participation, helping solve the problem, but doing so in a way where we are delivering a great experience that's branded and positive, and working to maintain customer satisfaction throughout the process. In fact, we have research that talks about, again, the same research study with payments, the fact that the probability of a customer choosing to interact with you and solve the problem when the approach is positive is about 3 times higher than when there's a negative approach. So it's dramatic differences on results on how you do this, how you interact with your customers, and treat them with respect and in a positive manner. I wanted to bring in one example. This happened to be from one of our customers that was using an outreach solution that they built internally before they started working with us. And of course, everything is anonymized in terms of the company, but I thought it was helpful to be able to look at this and use an example of what I consider a really unhealthy solution for customer service outreach. So in this case, John had their payment failed, and you can see that within this letter is a number of techniques that are incredibly assertive and aggressive, essentially blaming their customer for the problem of the failed payment. It's using fear-based tactics and trying to create pressure to sort of force their hand on working with them to solve the problem. You can imagine that if you receive a letter like this from one of the companies you're doing business with, or the organizations that you're providing donations to on an ongoing basis, that the immediate reaction when you receive a letter like this is going to be negative. I don't have to work with you. I don't have to solve this. It's just easier not to. And clearly, whether you're talking about the brand experience from a for-profit company, or perhaps even more important from a nonprofit, where the overall satisfaction, the good feelings that your sustainers or customers get from working with you, trying to make sure that we never deliver this kind of experience while we're working with them to solve the problem is incredibly important. So I think this is a good poster child of probably what not to do. So what does best practice look like, right? What is a best-in-class approach would look like? So number one, when we talk about recovery, we have to recognize that there is no single recovery method that can solve all types of failed payments. And some failed payments can be solved working with the payment system, some require customer support, and having a solution that can evaluate each individual transaction and create paths, create routing processes that leverage that is incredibly important to recognize. So, having different solutions and approaches to be able to be applied selectively, working against the same types of KPIs. We want to deliver the top performance gains in our recovery and our revenue. We want to optimize customer satisfaction throughout the experience and the retention of those customers. In fact, the 2 ways to measure that, again, are directly in measuring when a customer is recovered from a failed payment experience. Track the number of payments they make after that experience. It gives you both insight into the retention rates, as well as easy calculation of the LTV of that customer following recovery. The other recommendation is often it's helpful to run customer satisfaction surveys against those customers afterward to validate that the experience that your customers and sustainers are experiencing is positive for them. Okay, now one of the promises we made when we invited you to the session is that we want to provide a scorecard for you that you can use to evaluate your failed payment recovery solution. So I'm going to bring that up now. And what you see on the screen is available on the desktop. You're going to have easy access to download it. And this is a PDF file that is interactive and allows you to take the concepts that we talked about here and evaluate different solutions against different criteria. I think it's a really helpful tool to be able to start to apply this new knowledge that you have access to and use the context of all the factors that you find most important to find a solution that works best for your needs and will support your business or your organization as strong as possible. So there's some instructions here, but it's pretty easy tool to use. You want to go in and just write in the names of the different solutions you're comparing. And there's a number of criteria that are grouped into 3 different buckets. The first section really talks about overall capabilities. For example, is there an option to work directly with the payment system to recover payments so that we can recover failed payments invisibly without the customer knowledge? Is there a solution design that when we have to interact with the customer, we work to maintain customer satisfaction? Questions like that. Do you operate in multiple countries and support multi-currencies? If you are an international organization, that becomes really important. So it allows you to evaluate different providers. There's also a section about the technology to work directly with the payment system that goes into a little more detail. And questions to ask. And I think what's really useful about this tool is not just that allows you to evaluate third-party solutions, but if you do have an in-house solution that's been built by your teams, it's a great way to compare what you have today versus purpose-built solutions that are probably operating more at the state of the art and give you a sense of the additional kinds of benefits that those solutions can provide versus the home-built solutions. And then lastly, there is a section to evaluate when you are having to work with your customers or sustainers, important questions to ask about different capabilities. Do you support email or SMS? Is it integrated in your call center? Can you use this in different channels? Can you create ways that customers can go easily online and update their payment information? All these different criteria that are factors that should be considered. And we also want to point out that each row has a little note on the description that you can click and open, and it gives you a description of what that question is asking about and why it's important to have an answer that fits your needs for your organization that best meets what the solution provides. And then the easy calculation is if the solution meets your needs, put a 1 in there, and if it doesn't, leave a blank. And at the end of this sheet at the bottom, there'll be an easy calculation that's created that will add up and provide a score value for you for the different selections and provide your rank ordering. So easy to use tool, and hopefully you find value in that. Again, it's on the desktop. You can download it and use it to your heart's content. So we're running out of time. That brings me to the end of today's presentation. I do want to open up again. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to stay online as long as possible to get through them. I do have a question in from Lauren. Lauren says, Steve, you talked a lot about the factors considered for a failed payment recovery solution. Yep. And she says, I understand that there's a lot to consider, but what would you recommend that the most important factor to consider is, particularly if we're just getting started, if we don't have an existing recovery solution, but we're looking to get started? And it's a great question. Probably one of the most important factors that's always going to be weighted is the actual recovery rates the solution provides. That's probably a great place to start. I think what you'll find, though, is the nuances about retention is the second most important factor. If there is a recovery solution that is initially effective but causes bad customer experiences, in some cases, like the example I showed from one of our customers, that was being sent by their customer service team. So avoiding those types of experiences for your customers or sustainers is incredibly important. So measuring the retention and the duration of relationship after the recovery experience is probably the second most important factor to consider, recommend. Okay, I will wait online for another minute or two. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to throw them in. I don't see any yet. So I will stay online, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great, important, vital topic for so many different businesses. I can guarantee you're experiencing pain from this problem today. And the sooner you get focused on finding a solution that best meets your needs, that delivers the best-in-class recovery rates, that gives you great experiences for your customers or sustainers, and helps drive additional revenue and profits for profit businesses, and more revenue and resources to work with for nonprofits, for your organization. It just makes your life easier. It really solves one of the biggest problems, the biggest challenges you have to maintain retention, increase the resources you have to work with. So thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate it, and good luck on your journey. Thank you.